right? And we can keep on coming back to that, but all these forms are so historical, you know. Okay, we've got Devon here, right? If somebody says, I told him so, they are not mispronouncing him and saying him instead of him. They are using the Old English word himna, which was the precursor to what we say now as him, himna. So, I told him so, is what they're saying. Something that goes back, what, 1700 years, right? Johnny come lately, him comes along, and people think that's so wonderful, right? We can go on and on and on with all of that, but the sources give us our pedigree. Streamlining. Okay, I've just mentioned one little bit of grammar, but what about people saying you shouldn't say hisself or theirselves? You know, he hurt himself, and so on. Well, compare I hurt my possessive self. She hurt her possessive self. Why not then? He hurt his possessive self. Or they hurt their possessive selves. That reflexive pronoun system that we've got in standard English is all over the place. Okay, some of it has the first part as a possessive, some of it doesn't. So people who are saying himself and their selves, they are being very regular and streamlined and smooth about it. There's a lot of smoothing there. People say write, wrote, wrote instead of having the last one as written. Okay, well, you know, let's simplify it, you know, they say. We'll keep it simple. Multiple negation. I didn't do nothing. Well, I didn't do nothing, no. Okay? Until the 19th century, multiple negation was fine. Look at Shakespeare, it's full of it. But somehow maths got involved. Were you taught two negatives make a positive? Yes, that's right. Yeah, and you know, students now are still being taught that two negatives make a positive. Bogus, totally bogus. Whoever said that mathematics had to do with language? It doesn't. And the whole, right back through history, English used multiple negation to say, okay, well, it's not just negative, it's very negative, or it's very, very negative, and you can heap them all together and bring them all along. Streamlining, using the language creatively is something which you find in the non-standard dialects and should not be set at nothing by the people who are advocating simply standard English. It's not to say that I would allow my students to write me essays that weren't in standard English. You know, they don't know the difference between less and fewer. They certainly learn it pretty damn fine. But at the same time, we know where the non-standard dialects are coming from. That's my second one, sources and streamlining. Situation, regional dialectology. Okay, here we are with what we are particularly concerned with on this day. There are we're talking inter-community variation, differences between different communities. There are giveaways of regionality. Yes. You know, if somebody opens their mouth, you can tell I'm a West Midlander pretty well straight away. Okay, because I've got certain giveaways, although I've got lots of other things about me. I've got certain things. I tend to say wrong and thing and so on, you know. And I oscillate between grass and grass or path and path and so on. I can do all of that stuff because that's kind of where I'm from. And you can place me. And one of the delights of our business is that we revel in spotting where people come from. You see, you know, where they're about. But a couple of buts. But constant change. We're not in the business of trying to hold the line or teach young people to speak an old dialect. I hope we're not anyway. To speak old dialect as if, you know, they are like their great grandparents or something or other. Constant change. Chaucer's different from Shakespeare. Shakespeare's different from us, and all the shades in between. We speak a living language, and living things change all the time. And the dialects are living dialects in the same way as anything else. So, constant change. The other thing, and this is a bit more controversial perhaps, there are no such things as dialect areas. Back in the early 20th century, a French dialectologist called Gaston Paris said, there are no dialects. He said it in French, but his name's as far as I'm going to go with that. There are no dialects. And he didn't mean everybody speaks the same. What he meant was you can't count them. I get phone calls, usually in the silly season when journalists have got nothing better to do. I get phone calls and they say, how many dialects are there then? They usually put then on the end as a challenge, you know. How many dialects are there then? My stock answer to that is, how many do you want? You want two, I can give you them. Okay, in England, north and south. If you want 475, I'll find them for you. Right? Because things merge into one another. We know that there aren't hard and fast boundaries between where certain forms exist. If my PowerPoint had worked, I'd have shown you a sequence of 4 different maps based on the findings of our BBC Voices project, which we ran with the BBC in 2005 to 7, where people were invited to send in their information, particularly about words. And they did it in such large numbers, we had about 750,000 responses. We got in such large numbers that we were able to compute it, quantify it, and crunch that. It's big data, and so we could do big data stuff with it. And the sequence I was going to show you was, we asked that data for 5 different dialect areas, to look at that fairly crudely, to divide the whole of the UK up into 5 different areas. And it'll do it. Then we said, okay, ask it to a little bit finer, 6 areas. And it stays much the same, except that something that was called the North of England, and this is where the Northumbrians here will be pleased, the North of England divides at that point into the North of England, the main North of England, and Northumbria, as a separate area. We asked it then to divide it up more finely into 12 areas and then 20 areas, and the more we did, the more it shattered. This whole simple picture of nice tidy dialect areas, the more refined we wanted it to be, the more the whole thing broke apart. Keep it simple, you get a lot of stuff about the north-south divide within England, and I immediately say, what about me as a Midlander? I'm not a northerner, I'm not a southerner. I've got some forms that are northern, I've got some forms that are southern, I've got some forms that are distinctly Midland. And as soon as you start, the 15 million or so Midlanders start jumping up and down and saying, what about us, what about us? You immediately get a little fragmentation there, but it goes on from there. There are no such things as dialect areas. You can't draw lines around them. Okay, that's enough about the situational side of things. Society. Talked mainly about regional dialectology, but society has a part to play in it. Social dialectology has become very much one of the front runners in the study of dialects generally. And that is not looking at differences between different communities, but at differences within communities. According to such so-called independent speaker variables as class, different classes, that's a difficult one to actually define, but class, age, differences between age groups within a community, gender, ethnicity, the way people lock together into so-called networks, different styles that people use and so on, looking at that but focusing down on one place, maybe a city, maybe a town, maybe even a village, and looking to see what's going on there. And the idea of that is very much historically oriented, like the early dialectologists going from village to village speaking to the peasants. It's to try and get a handle on how things are changing, but to go one layer beyond that to how things are changing, what is making them change. Harold Orton said to me, you know, we can tell what's changed and so on, but we'll never be able to find out why. And just about the time he said that, in the early 70s, in America they were starting to do work on this social dialectology to try and answer exactly that. Why do things change? And it's the only really technical term I'm going to use, but applying here is something called the uniformitarian principle. Right? And some of you might know about it. It applies not just in language, but other things as well. But if you want to stop a conversation at a dinner party, okay, turn to your neighbour and say, what's your view on the uniformitarian principle? cut them out. The uniformitarian principle very simply says, we are no different, actually, as human beings, from the human beings who brought English to this country in the 5th century. We are no different to the people in medieval England, and so on. We interact with one another in the same way, we project ourselves in the same way, we have the same needs, the same wishes, all of that. And if we can understand what people are doing now, we will have a handle on what people were doing in the Middle English period, or the Old English period as well, and what kicked change along. What made people start speaking differently between the period of Chaucer and Shakespeare, for example. And we look at the history of how society was organised then and draw parallels with now, and we can work that out. So social dialectology is a very important part of this, and it goes back to that dialects are not only regional, they are social. They have a social element to them. And we know from our own communities that we don't speak the same as young people do. We don't speak the same as our parents and grandparents did. It's moving along all the time, and social dialectology digs into that.